Hello everyone, welcome to this next video in English 100. Today we're going to be practicing rhetorical analysis. Of course, this is leading up to your first assignment. And to that end, I think it would be good for us to have a look at this image here. So, what have we got in front of us? The artist you can probably guess, right? So it's Pablo Picasso. It was painted in 1913 and it's called Woman in Armchair. So, okay, I guess we've got a woman, right? She's here somewhere. We've got hair at the top. We've got some breasts. We have a navel. We have some fingernails. And you can make out the image of an armchair around her. Okay, so here's the question. Is she in love? You know, one of my students last year, when I asked that question, said, well, she must be excited because her nipples are erect. Sometimes I actually miss being in the classroom. Is she a Republican or a Democrat? What do you think? What's her job? Is she married? Does she have children? What's her favorite color? Does she have pets? What's my point? We know nothing. Okay, we know nothing about this woman. She's a fragmented, blasted image of what a woman is. And it's precisely that image I want you to have in mind when you read, please, the text we're going to study in this video. This is a text that I've already sent you. Let me just bring it up on the screen here. So it's called The Female Body. It's by Margaret Atwood. And as if we were in the class right now, what I'd like you to do, please, is to read it. I'll give you 10 minutes. I'll pause the video here, and then we'll meet up again. All right, so you have now finished reading this text. And of course, you remember the first step of a rhetorical analysis is to figure out the message of the text. What is the writer in this case arguing for or against? Pretty clear here, don't you think? I mean, there are different ways of saying it or writing it, but I think Atwood here is complaining about or arguing against the objectification of the female body, the way that women are represented, misrepresented, perceived by men and by society at large. Anything along those lines and you've got yourself a message, all right? The next step, of course, is for us to explore the rhetorical strategies and devices that are being used to drive the message, to communicate the message. So, thinking about that, let's think about strategies. What do you think is the primary strategy at work in this text? As I see it, it is primarily pathos. This is a writer who is angry and communicating her anger, engaging with us in that sense. This is highly emotive. When you're reading something and you feel moved, perhaps annoyed, upset, or amused, you know this is pathos. You're being worked on in that way. So yeah, I think this is primarily pathos. But of course, it's also ethos. This is a woman writing about being a woman. And I mean, I can't do that, right? So there is an element of ethos there too. As for logos, well, I don't know. This is where we can disagree with each other. I don't really see much reasoned, careful, logical argument in this text. It seems to be more emotionally pitched. At least that's how I see this. So I guess if I was writing a rhetorical analysis, I would identify the message first, what the argument's about, and then I would shift into a thesis statement, of course, what I feel about it, and we'll come back to that a bit later. And then I would start analyzing the language, beginning with the strategies and saying what I just said, that this is primarily pathos. Maybe I'd give an example of that, talk about ethos too, and then I'm going to move into the rhetorical devices, which is actually what I want to concentrate on today as we work through this text. Before we get into the detail at the beginning here, a couple of things. What you should do, I suggest, whenever you get a text delivered to you to read that you've never seen before, is you should just look at the print in front of you, the actual sort of black-white form in front of you on a page, because that's going to suggest to you immediately what the structure is. I mean, yes, it's going to tell you how much you've got to read, yeah, but it might also suggest structure. In this case, as you kind of flick through it, you're going to see that there are these numbered sections. There's section 1, there's section 2, there's section 3. In fact, there are 7 of them. You don't know why yet, you haven't even started reading, but you've picked that up and it's given you an idea of structure in your mind. The other thing to be looking out for, whatever text you're looking at in whatever course, is for anything which seems to stand out structurally. This could be a section or a paragraph or a line which is much longer than the rest or much shorter than the rest. It stands out for that reason. And you should just note that, remember it, because there should be a reason why it's standing out if it's well written. Okay, another quick question. Let's just look at the beginning here. We've got the title. Above that, we've got the name of the writer, Margaret Atwood. Then we have the title of the essay. What should you notice next when you're reading this? What is the next thing you should notice? Now, I ask that in the classroom. It's almost like a game, because hardly anybody ever gives me the correct answer. I'll repeat the question. After the name of the writer and the title of the essay, what should you see next? Now, the correct answer is a quotation mark and 3 dots. That's what you should see next. This tiny detail is a rhetorical device in itself. It's called ellipsis. And it's telling us that the writer is cutting and pasting and selecting material, hiding material perhaps. It could be very important. I don't think it is here. And I'm kind of playing with you. You could get an A+ analyzing this text without mentioning the ellipsis at the beginning. So it's not a big deal. But I'm saying this to you firstly so you're aware that that's what ellipsis is. But secondly, to indicate to you how carefully you need to start reading if you're not already. You need to see what's there in almost forensic detail. Okay, we have the quote from the Michigan Quarterly Review. And then we have this first section. In the classroom, I ask students to spend a few minutes with their neighbors just going through this first section and asking themselves, how does the language in this first section communicate the message? Maybe that's something you could have a think about now for maybe a minute or two. I guess I'll pause it here for a couple of minutes and then come back to you. Okay, so we're thinking about this first section. The mistake that students tend to make in the classroom when they reply to the question is that they just repeat what's there. They just tell me what Atwood is saying. Well, I know what she's saying because I've read it. We all have. The, 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 the question here is to analyze what is being said. What language devices are being used here in this first section? What should we notice? Well, I guess to begin with, we're going to notice first person. He's talking about I. And then we have this kind of jumble of adjectives and nouns in the form of a list. A list is a rhetorical device here. But more than anything else, or at least let's clarify what's happening here, is the use of metaphor. I mean, that's what these adjectives and nouns are forming. Okay, we have a succession of metaphors. Okay, so remember how we do things here. We notice something and then we ask why. I was talking to you about that in the previous video. So, okay, we notice that we've got metaphors all over the place in this first section. Question is why? Why is she writing all these metaphors? I think the answer is revealed to us when we remember what a metaphor is. So I'm now going to repeat for you what I gave you in the first class, which is the definition of a metaphor that you will find in a dictionary, in this case the Oxford English Dictionary. So a metaphor is the use of a descriptive word or phrase applied to an object in an imaginative way. And hopefully the thing that's screaming out at you is metaphors applied to objects. And this whole text is about objectification. There's something intrinsic to the metaphor itself that objectifies. So therefore, if I'm going to write a text about objectification, complaining about it in this case, the rhetorical device that lends itself to that process is going to be metaphor. Let's just think a bit more about what metaphor is. And to that end, I've got a text which I think is going to help us. This is from a book called Word and World by Kent Lewis, who's actually a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine at Capilano. And so you can see 2 or 3 pages he's got here on metaphors. This is sent to you as an email attachment, or it's on Moodle, so you have it. And I'm certainly not going to read through every line right now, but just some of the salient points. So you can see how he begins here. Metaphors and figurative speech are statements that make comparisons between objects, some literally spelled out, others implied. And this figurative language or figurative speech makes up a huge chunk of daily language. And you can see his examples there. He then gives us, I think, a very helpful list of kinds of figurative speech, or if you like, species of metaphoric language. So here we have the simile, which, as you know, compares 2 distinct objects using like or as. So it's an overt form of figurative speech and honestly declares its comparison, using the like or as to suggest a parallel between 2 objects. If we shift to the next page, we can see the difference between simile and metaphor. It's quite an important one. Metaphor, as Lewis states, creates an identity between 2 distinct objects. So it presents the first object as if it were the same, synonymous with the second, the same thing. And so it's more drastic than a simile. The metaphor goes beyond mere resemblance and creates an out-and-out substitution. And again, you can read his examples. Then we have this list of different species of metaphor. Personification, imbuing inanimate objects or abstractions with human or living qualities. Synecdoche describes a figure of a speech in which a part of an object stands for the whole. Metonymy uses a closely related word, object, or attribute to substitute for the thing itself. Movie directors typically use eyeglasses to metonymically suggest the character's intelligence. Imagery, we talked about in the last class, refers to statements that provide visual information. Allegory describes a story in which every narrative element stands for something else in the real or spiritual world. It's like an extended or sustained metaphor. Symbol, an object that represents something else in a formal and conventional manner. And then we have the archetype, the Jungian notion of the universal symbol whose meaning remains constant in all cultures. Now we have a section on how metaphors work. And about halfway down here we have a reference to the critic I.A. Richards and some helpful terms for analyzing metaphors. So the subject of the metaphor, as Lewis says here, the real beastie idea or thing referred to is the tenor, and the object of comparison or substitute is called the vehicle. So if we go back to the rather unpleasant example I gave you of a metaphor in the first class, he is a pig. He is the tenor, pig is the vehicle. And then to unpack the metaphor, what you do is explore the properties of the vehicle. You think of piggy things and you sort of project them onto him, and you have this rather disturbing image. That's how metaphors work. So let us now move on and consider how metaphors operate in our day-to-day life. I'm going to leave you to read that left-hand column in your own time, and we come to the top of the next column. As Lewis says, a metaphor is more than a potent communicator. It's a necessity of thought itself, a basic tool in our cognitive process. It's not some artsy-fartsy English 100 thing, you just move on from. It's intrinsic to your life. We use metaphors to articulate emotions and ideas, giving a concrete form to intangible thoughts and feelings. And so you see Lewis's examples here. He was shattered. I feel like $1 million. It's a primary activity of consciousness. On something of a tangent, I'm thinking of two philosophers in particular, 20th century philosophers. One of them, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was Austrian but did most of his work in Cambridge in the UK, and he died in 1951. And Mikhail Bakhtin, who was Russian, who died in 1975. They were both working on the same thing, coming up with the same ideas, but never knew about each other. In fact, nobody knew about Bakhtin really, because he did not publish anything. He recognized that if he did so, he would almost certainly be arrested and shot. He was working behind, as Churchill would call it, the Iron Curtain in Stalinist Russia. And a lot of what he was writing about was to do with carnival and the subversive dimensions and properties of language, clearly incendiary in a totalitarian regime that he was living in. So what were they saying about language, apart from that? Let me put it to you like this. For thousands of years, at least in the Western Hemisphere, people thought of language as a neutral thing. It's just something you use to describe stuff. I guess that's how we grow up thinking about language, if we ever think about it. It's like a window. We just look through it onto the world. But what Wittgenstein and Bakhtin, and of course there are others, and they're precursors before the 20th century, but what they are exploring is the idea that really language is the only thing we've got, or to put it another way, the window is the only thing we've got. Let me give you one of Wittgenstein's examples, which will sort of hopefully clarify what the argument is here. Imagine that you have a pain in your stomach. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to a doctor, all right? So what is the doctor going to ask you to do? Doctor, I've got a pain in my stomach. What will the doctor ask you to do? They will ask you to describe your pain. So, what do you need in order to describe your pain? Answer, metaphor or simile. And you're going to have to find one. And so you will think about it, and then you will say to the doctor, well, you know what? It feels like it's feels like a dagger or a knife just sticking in my side. Or it feels like I swallowed a gallon of cold milk this morning and I just can't get rid of it. I mean, these are similes that you're finding to describe your condition. And now the doctor can start to think about a diagnosis depending upon the metaphor or the simile you've given them. And so it is, you only have appendicitis or a tumor or an ulcer because of the metaphor or the simile that got you there. I mean, that's kind of what's being suggested. Let's go back to Atwood's text and start piecing this all together. Let's think of a woman. Let's give her name, Margaret Atwood. And let's think of everything that she is, all her intelligence, her creativity, her proclivities, her interests, her ambitions, her loves, her desires, her hopes and her despairs. And let's do this to her. Let's say, here's Margaret Atwood, tenor, vehicle, female body. And the metaphorizing, objectifying process has begun. And now we just run with the ball, to use a metaphor. So why not have female body tenor equals hot topic, vehicle? And you can see what she's starting to do in this text, in this essay. One more, why not have hot topic as the tenor equals it as the vehicle? And now everything that she is as a human being and as a woman is reduced down to this impersonal pronoun, it. That's the point she's making. That's what happens in the metaphorizing process. Lewis is kind of talking about the same thing when he goes to this part of his essay. I'm taking you to the final page here. This column on the right, he says, feminists worry about metaphors that present women as foxes, bunnies, or chicks, fearing that such animal imagery dehumanizes. Terms such as babes, playmates, or girls further rob women of adult status. And just as worrisome are the battle of the sexes metaphors, where good looks appear as a weapon, she's devastatingly beautiful, a knockout, a bombshell, and sex becomes aggression. He hit on her, she resisted his advances, she banged him. Extraordinary words that we use here, metaphors, and this is the danger of how metaphors are used. This book, Cambodia, which of course you are already starting to read, is all about the power of metaphor and how dangerous it can be and what we need to do to protect ourselves against metaphors. This concern is replicated here by Lewis in the left-hand column in front of you. In addition to misdirection, metaphors introduce unwanted noise into our thoughts. Distortion is inevitable. And he says here, because tenor and vehicle differ, all metaphors deform and misrepresent their subjects to a degree. This is a critical point, says Lewis. Metaphors purport to inform, but by presenting one thing in terms of another, by speaking of X in terms of Y, they also distort, warp, and disfigure. Well, okay, true, I suppose, sometimes. We are critical readers, and we don't just accept what we read because it's written by an academic and presented by an academic. Much as I love and admire Kent, I disagree with this. I disagree with this. Whilst I think he's right in many respects and in many occasions, metaphors, as we've just been talking about, are fundamentally important to how we appreciate the world and ourselves. How can we evince or articulate appreciation of aesthetics or beauty or love or friendship without using metaphoric language? So it's not all bad. It's not all heavy. It's not the case, I think, that all metaphors distort and warp. Metaphors can be beautiful. And we should at least remember that and think about that. And my broader point, of course, is that we shouldn't just swallow what we're given to read because it's academic. Okay, I want to go back now to the first section. And hopefully you get it now. I mean, if you didn't already, this is why we have a succession of metaphors in this first section. And I guess the suggestion at the end here, when she's saying avocado, alderman, adjective, is almost as though we have a lexicon, we have a list of words you can use to objectify or metaphorize the female body, beginning with A's, and then she could go on to B's and C's and D's. I guess that's what she's getting at here. Okay, let's just look at this second section now. What do you notice about the language of this second section? And how does it connect with and communicate her message? Well, we've got a list of things, and some of them are weird, aren't they? I mean, I don't even know what is a stomacher. I can imagine what it is. A bustle, a panty girdle, you know, but it becomes clear as we read through that this is a list of garments, accessories for the bedroom, I suppose. These are garments used to accessorize the female body as a sex object, an object of desire in that sense. So, okay, that list is helping her to sort of communicate her message here. But there are a couple of things we should notice about this list, because what comes at the end? Yeah, so you know, gentlemen out there, don't forget that your girlfriend has a brain, right? Because that's Atwood's point. It's the last thing men think about. And how does she make her point? With rhetoric, with language. She does it with a rhyme. Bed, head. This creates, in a sense, a reverse hook. The punch comes at the end rather than as we're used to so far at the beginning. It's a reverse hook set up by the rhyme. What else might we notice about this list? Well, what about this? What if I was to go into the lingerie section of the Bay, and you never know, I might, and asked to see their latest collection of brassieres, stomachers, and panty girdles. It's rather a disturbing image, isn't it? Well, yes, indeed, I might be shown to security straight away, but if I was to ask to see their latest collection of lycra and lace teddies, they'd probably say, well, here you are, sir. What's my point? That what we've got here is a list of accessories that take us way back in time to accessories that are no longer used, that people don't even know about anymore. Right up to the present with the references to lycra. So, in other words, Atwood, I think, is saying this is how the female body has been dressed and accessorized and has been throughout history, throughout this sort of chronology that she's setting out here in section 2. Okay, let's move on to section 3. Have another read and have a think about how the language in section 3 is pushing or communicating her message. Right, so what do you think? The tone here is a little different, isn't it? I mean, it's suggestive of almost technical writing, a sort of technical manual. It's almost as though the female body now is something you might see in a biology lab or a workshop, and you can sort of put it on the table, and you can just take things in and out of it, and it's that kind of a representation now of what the female body is. In fact, it reminds me, in particular, this section of this. This is why I showed this to you at the very beginning, this idea of fragmentation and separation and parts, to be assembled. So I guess that's suggested by the tone, the use of the plural pronoun we. It's a very kind of official, authoritarian type of text here. We'll talk about that a bit later in another video. We have a reference here to semiotics, this association of signs and symbols, in this case color with gender, as if male is blue and pink is female. Totally bizarre how that's evolved and how deep it is in the psyche of young kids, at least. I mean, my 6-year-old boy doesn't want to go near anything pink at the moment. How has that happened? I'm sure he'll grow out of that very soon, but it seems as though the correlation of color to gender is a 1960s marketing trick. You can do your own research on that. Semiotics is an interesting area of study. It's the study of signs and symbols. It sort of connects with the Jungian archetypes we mentioned a bit earlier. But I think that's what she's exploring here, the kind of manufactured way in which we tend to think about gender. Okay, now we come to this interesting section 4. So, what have we got going on here? Well, it's immediately apparent that we have a dialogue. In fact, this is a reported dialogue because there are no quotation marks. So Atwood doesn't want to give up that much control. She's controlling what's being said here. It's reported to us. Why do we have dialogue or reported dialogue in text? One of the reasons is to freshen up text. It's to entice, excite, interest the reader in a different way. And I think that's partly what's going on here, rhetorically speaking. The other function of it in this text is so as to present us with a male persona. and a male voice, albeit sort of a hearsay voice, but there he is. And he's quite strange, this guy, it seems. I mean, to begin with, he comes across as politically correct. I mean, you know, some right-on dude who lives on Commercial Drive here in Vancouver. You know, he doesn't want his daughter to have a Barbie doll or anything like that because she might start stereotyping. Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. But when the doll comes whizzing down the stairs, you know, naked with the head chopped off, or, you know, arms missing or whatever, that's all right. It's kind of a weird subversion of his position. It's almost as though, you know, to begin with, he's politically correct, but at the end, he's saying, well, it's okay if my daughter's a psychopath. You know, it's kind of odd the way that his position is tumbled here. And then you have the ironic statement at the end, I guess we're safe. So I think that's what she's doing. She's activating the text here, giving it an interesting dynamic, and enabling us to hear at least a male voice, although you can see what she's doing to it. Section 5 takes us to the commodification of the female body, its use. And here the focus is very much on the body as impersonal pronoun, as object, which, as you can see at the beginning, is used to sell things. And I think the tone here is deliberately light and fluffy. To begin with, just squeeze the brass legs together and out comes your nut. I mean, I think we're supposed to smile. I think she's wanting us to do that. It's deliberate. She's talking about advertising, how the female body sells cars, beer, cigarettes, and so on. We're familiar with all of that. But then it gets darker. I talked to you in the last class about contrast. It should just be always in the back of your mind. That use of contrast to see what's in front of you. And look how it's operating here. It does not merely sell, it is sold. And in this paragraph and the next one, Atwood is clearly taking us to prostitution and how the female body is sold in that sense. And more than that, worse than that, arguably, it seems to be child prostitution. We have hairless pre-teen legs. Look at the imagery here. And we can imagine these punters, these men, these businessmen. She describes them as flying into the country, practically crawling in, as though they're in the undergrowth, like insects, suitful after suitful, lured. We have another male voice here in these two paragraphs. Again, very sort of reported hearsay. And I don't know what guy you have in your mind. For me, it's some fat American guy in the back of a Cadillac with a cigar in his mouth. I mean, that's just the image I have because of the way she's using language. For you, it may be different, but there he is, and he's sitting in the back of his car saying, what's your problem? Yeah, they're good for the economy. They don't make them like they used to, like those good old American cars. They're shoddy goods. Look at the sentence fragment, shoddy goods. You can't write in sentence fragments in English 100, but you can when you're Margaret Atwood, writing a text like this. And there's a reason why she's writing now in a sentence fragment, because everything is becoming fragmented, like that Picasso image I was showing you. So it's like a punch again, it's a reverse hooker. The beginning of this section, section 5, is so light and fluffy and amusing, and then she really changes the tone. And the tone is changed because of the images, the metaphors, the similes that are at work here. Very dark now. You're not laughing, right? You're not smiling anymore. The text won't let you. Section 6. What's the first thing you should notice about section 6? It goes to something I said at the beginning of this video. You look at something on the desk right in front of you or on the computer screen, and you just look at the structure and you look for standout sections or paragraphs. Here we have a section which is shorter, quite a bit shorter than any of the others. There is probably a good reason for that. It's probably because it's particularly important. So, what is being said in section 6 that might make it particularly important? Just have another read of section 6. You see, I think there's a word, one word, that shouts at us, and which, at least for me, changes my reading of this text profoundly, how I even think about it. It's one word in this section 6. Can you find it? It's the word daughter. It's not daughter with a capital D. I suppose it could mean all my daughters out there, but at least my reading of this suggests she's writing this to her own daughter. And that astonishes me, disturbs me very much, that a mother would feel this way about what it is to be a woman today, and then communicate that or project that onto her daughter. It confuses me, perhaps upsets me even, but what it does more than anything else is that it personalizes this text and makes me rethink about everything in the text. And that's why I think it's particularly important, and that's why I think this section is short. And then look what happens next. It's classic Atwood. It's like she hits us in the gut, and then she tells us a joke about hermaphrodites. It's like, to use a simile, it's like a sugar-coated pill. This is how she writes. She's very, very clever. And it's not until afterwards sometimes you realize, oh my God, is that what she just said? Because it tasted sweet at the time. It's clever writing, I think. Now we come to this much longer section 7. Let's just read it through, shall we? So each female body contains a female brain. Handy. Makes things work. Stick pins in it and you get amazing results. Old popular song. Short circuits. Bad dreams. So we should be familiar now with some of her techniques. You see the use of sentence fragments. Handy is not a sentence. It's a fragment. Short circuits, bad dreams, these are fragments now. In fact, it's almost as though the whole text is starting to fragment as we read through it. And light and fluffy, handy, makes things work, get amazing results, and then we have the bad dreams at the end. So the punch is like a reverse hook. It comes at the end of the paragraph. Anyway, each of these brains has 2 halves. They're joined together by a thick cord. What do you see next? The answer is a semicolon. Right? Doesn't seem like a big deal. Neural pathways flow from one to the other, sparkles of electric information washing to and fro, like light on waves, like a conversation. See how the similes are coming back to us. How does a woman know? She listens in. The male brain, now that's a different matter. Only a thin connection. What do you see next? What you see is a period. Now, semicolon for female, period for male. Period suggests greater separation, detachment, or a thinner connection, as she says here. Trust me, please. This is deliberate. I mean, think about it this way. You are all, I'm sure, good at something, right? You may be great at English, I don't know, but you're great at something, right? It could be riding horses, playing music, playing video games, sport, whatever. You're really good at something. She's really good at writing. And when you are working with your craft at this level, nothing is there by accident, and that includes tiny punctuation marks. It's very, very consciously and carefully put together. Right, here we are, guys. This is the male brain. The right brain doesn't know what the left brain is doing. I think my wife would agree with that sometimes. Good for aiming, though, for hitting the target when you pull the trigger. What's the target? Who's the target? Who cares? What matters is hitting it. That's the male brain for you. Sentence fragment. Here's the word objective, because that's what this is all about. This is why men are so sad. Why they feel so cut off, why they think of themselves as orphans cast adrift, footloose and stringless in the deep void. What void, she asks. What are you talking about? The void of the universe, he says. And she says, oh, and looks out the window and tries to get a handle on it, but it's no use. There's too much going on, too many rustlings in the leaves, too many voices. So she says, would you like a cheese sandwich, a piece of cake, a cup of tea? And he grinds his teeth because she doesn't understand and wanders off, not just alone, but alone, lost in the dark, lost in the skull, searching for the other half, the twin who could complete him. And then it comes to him. He's lost the female body. Look, it shines in the gloom. Far ahead, a vision of wholeness, rightness, like a giant melon, like an apple, like a metaphor for breast in a bad sex novel. Guys, you get it now, all right? This is what she's doing. It's back to the beginning. It's metaphor for a simile, for a metaphor for a simile. She's just playing with that now. It shines like a balloon, like, well, it could be anything, a foggy noon, a watery moon, shimmering in its egg of light. Catch it. And everything now is reduced down to that impersonal pronoun object. Put it in a pumpkin, in a high tower. You know what you're thinking now? You're thinking fairy tale. It's an allusion to fairy tale and how we bring up our children to think about gender in this sense. In a compound, it's getting darker, isn't it? In a chamber, in a house, in a room, quick, stick a leash on it, that impersonal object pronoun, a lock, a chain, some pain. We've got the rhyme going here, guys. Settle it down so it can never get away from you again. Bang. There's the punch set up by the rhyme. Gentlemen out there, how are you feeling? Yeah? Do you think this is a fair representation of how you see women? I ask that in the classroom and nobody ever says yes. No surprise there. But then I ask the same question to the women in my class. And I nearly always get a few nods yes. And then I get some nods no, and then quite a number of women tend to be like that. Kind of. Interesting, don't you think? What we've been doing, really, for the last, 30, 40 minutes is step 2, right? I mean, we talked about strategies quickly, pathos, ethos, but the rest of the time we've been exploring how the rhetorical devices have been pushing her message. And now we get to step 3. Step 3 is the critique. The things we like and don't like about this as a text, as an argument. Let's consider what we may criticize in what we've just been reading together, the things we don't like about it. I mean, I think there are quite a few things we could talk about. It seems to be full of hasty generalizations about all sorts of things. I'm sort of priming you for what I'm going to do in the next video, which is where we will talk about hasty generalization as a fallacy, as a weakness of argument. And arguably that's happening a lot here. In fact, what you could say is that it is so generalized, so exaggerated, hyperbolic is the word, that it actually does to men the very thing that she's complaining about is done to women. In other words, she's objectifying, stereotyping the male persona here so as to make her case against objectification. That's arguably a big problem in this text. I mean, that's up to you, of course, how you see that. She's making assumptions about how men think, how men operate. This idea that there's something intrinsic in the male psyche that makes men more inclined to shoot at things, I should say, shouldn't I, rather than shoot up. So, yeah, so there's something intrinsic in the male psyche that makes us want to shoot things and attack things and hit things more than women. I don't know, is that right? It's something that perhaps if we were analysing this, we might want to do some research on and bring that into our essay and say, well, perhaps she's wrong in that. So yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of problems we can identify here if we want to. Another one is perhaps her simplification of the very notion of gender. This essay, I can tell you, was written in the 1990s. Margaret Atwood is still very much alive and doing fabulous work, but this was written in the 1990s, and I think it's fair to say that we progressed quite a lot since then in our understanding of gender, so that on the sort of biochemical spectrum, we can identify sort of anywhere on that spectrum and identify ourselves perhaps differently than as simply male or female. And so if you were writing an analysis about this text, you may want to say that, and you may want to say, look, she's generalizing in all sorts of ways, which is problematic, and that's a really big problem, the way that she's simplifying gender itself. So yeah, this is, I suppose, the process we would be going through now in writing an essay, just bringing these issues in. The question ultimately is whether these problems, if we see them as problems with this text, are enough to make us disagree with it, to reject its message. Ultimately, that's your call, right? It's your text now, it's your prerogative. But how might we see this in a positive light? How might we see this as a good text? Well, it's provocative. I hope you think and agree that it's interesting in that sense. I mean, I hope you're still awake. And it's engaging. And perhaps, I mean, it's clever. I mean, I hope we can agree that it's cleverly constructed in the way that it's using language, as I have hopefully demonstrated in the last 40 or 50 minutes. And then perhaps we could say this. Maybe she's aware, Atwood is aware of the risks she's taking rhetorically, particularly the risks she's taking with hyperbole and stereotyping. Maybe she's taking those risks deliberately so as to provoke us and get us to think afresh or anew about gender, about how we ourselves see gender and think about it. And if that's what we are now doing as a result of having read this text, then arguably it's a very successful text. It's achieved what she set out to achieve in its writing. Ultimately, you configure your critique to suit yourself. It's how you tell me what you feel about what you've just read. And that's exactly what you will do when you will come to your assignment. Before which there will be more practice and help. So in the next video, I'm going to take you to logos, because we haven't really talked about logos so far. We talked about pathos and ethos. But let's turn in the next video to the more rational and logical construction of an argument and how that can go wrong, which will take us to fallacy. Okay, well, thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much.